In the midst of the Vietnam War, on April 30, 1970, President Nixon publicly announced the launch of the Cambodian Campaign. Their goal was to defeat the 40,000 troops of the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam and the People's Army of Vietnam, who were now positioned near the eastern border of Cambodia. Upon hearing the news of the campaign, many students across the nation began to protest. Probably the most famous of these protests took place at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. On May 1st, a demonstration was organized on the campus commons. A crowd of roughly 500 students gathered to protest the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. There was a general consensus of anger and frustration during the demonstration, and many students spoke of bringing the war home. As the crowd dispersed to attend their 1 o'clock classes, they agreed to have another rally on May 4th. Around midnight that night, trouble broke out in the town as people leaving a bar began to throw beer bottles at nearby cars and store windows. Before long, a group of over 100 people had gathered. When the police finally arrived, the group had already set off a bank alarm, started a bonfire in the middle of the street, and began throwing beer bottles at police officers. The whole Kent police force, along with officers from surrounding communities and the county, were called in to help control the chaos. After being informed on the events in Kent, the mayor declared a state of emergency and ordered all of the bars to close early. This only angered the people even more. Eventually, the crowd was successfully disbanded when the police used tear gas to force the people out of town and closer to the campus. The next day, businesses received threats that caused the mayor to meet with the city officials and Governor Rhodes. When the decision was made to send the National Guard to Kent State University. Later that night, the protesters set the ROTC campus building on fire. Over 1,000 protesters surrounded the building in celebration. When the Kent firemen arrived to extinguish the fire, they were violently greeted by protesters throwing rocks and other objects at them. The National Guard arrived around 10 p.m. that night. Not long after their arrival, they had made many arrests and used tear gas to quiet the chaos for the time being. The next morning, Governor Rhodes spoke at a press conference held at Kent Firehouse. He called the protesters un-American and said, "They make definite plans of burning, destroying, and throwing rocks at the police and at the National Guard and Highway Patrol. This is when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency of Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We're going to eradicate the problem. We are not going to treat the symptoms." During his speech, he also claimed that he intended to go to the courts and declare an Ohio-wide state of emergency. This would have illegalized and put an end to student protests. However, he actually never attempted to do so. Another rally was held on the Commons that night around 8 p.m. Less than an hour after it had begun, the National Guard used tear gas to separate the crowd. This had little effect, though, because the protesters reassembled on Lincoln and Main Streets in hopes of having a meeting with the mayor. They were unsuccessful. At 11 p.m., the guardsmen announced a citywide curfew was now in place, and they began forcing students into their dorms. That night, as well as the night before, a couple students were bayoneted by guardsmen. Monday, May 4th, brought the climax of the Kent State Massacre. As scheduled 3 days prior, the rally was set for noon. Many of the university officials handed out thousands of flyers to students in an attempt to cancel the gathering. Despite their efforts, over 2,000 students gathered on the Commons near Taylor Hall. Kent State's iron victory bell signaled the beginning of the protest. For the National Guard, the ringing of the bell signaled the start of many attempts to disperse the protesters. They began by sending a guard in a jeep to inform the protesting students that they must stop what they were doing or face arrest. The students responded with violence and forced the guard to turn back. After a second failed attempt, the guards resorted to using tear gas. Because of the wind, however, the protesters were not affected by the tear gas. They responded by throwing rocks and gas canisters at the guards while shouting "Pigs off campus." While the guards decided that it would require more force to disperse the crowd, they advanced forward with rifles and bayonets toward hundreds of student protesters. After they moved across the campus, they ended up near the athletic practice field and the parking lot. Most of the students were approximately 150 to 225 feet from the guards. After the guards' advancement toward them, many of the protesters left. but those who stayed angrily fought back against the guards. 10 minutes later, the guards started to retreat. As they did so, some of the protesters followed them. According to eyewitness reports, the guards then turned around and began firing at students, as well as at the ground and in the air. A total of 67 shots were fired in just 13 seconds by 29 of the 77 National Guards that were present in Kent State that day. A member of the National Guard claimed the reason that the guards fired at the students was a sniper that had fired at the guards. This remains to be only a common allegation rather than fact. The result of those 13 seconds of shots fired was 4 deaths and 9 injuries. 2 of the 4 deaths, Allison Krauss and Jeffrey Miller, participated in the protest. The other 2, however, Sandra Schuer and William Knox Schroeder, were walking to their next class when they were killed. Soon after these students were killed, the protesters were about to attack the National Guards, when a geology professor at Kent State stepped forward and begged the students not to let the violence escalate more than it already had. The students discussed their options and in the end agreed to leave the Commons and end the protest. In later years, the father of Allison Krauss reflected on the tragic event of his daughter's death. He said, "She resented being called a bum because she disagreed with someone else's opinion. He felt that our crossing into Cambodia was wrong. Is this dissent a crime? Is it a reason for killing her? Have we come to such a state in this country that a young girl has to be shot because she disagrees deeply with the action of her government?" The Kent State massacre caused a lot of controversy across the country. Over 450 college campuses held demonstrations in response to the events at Kent State. It raised questions of whether or not it was legally justifiable to shoot American citizens, and whether the protests or banning them was constitutional. During the legal actions against those involved, the court decided the protests were in fact constitutional, and it was unjustifiable to ban the protests that occurred at Kent State or any other campus.